The funeral chapel was dead silent, the heavy scent of white lilies hanging in the air as I stood beside my mother's casket holding my father's trembling hand. My name is Jasmine. I am 42 years old, and on the worst day of my life, I truly believed I was entirely alone in my grief. Then my phone rang. In my panic to silence it, my fingers clumsily fumbled with the screen, accidentally hitting the speakerphone button instead of the power switch. Instantly, my husband Mark's voice echoed through the high ceilings of the church, loud, sharp, and dripping with arrogance. "I don't care that she's dead. Put me before your mother. Leave the funeral and get over to my family gathering right now." Every head turned. A collective gasp rippled across the pews, bouncing off the stained glass windows. Shame froze me in place. I stood paralyzed, staring at the screen in pure horror. That was when my father, Richard, gently let go of my hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't create a scene. He simply took the phone directly out of my trembling fingers, looked straight into the glowing screen, and spoke with a quiet, icy tone that sent chills down my spine. "Let's give him exactly what he wants." Without another word, he ended the call. What my self-absorbed husband had completely forgotten was that my quiet father held every single key to his financial survival, and the payback had officially begun. Looking back, Mark hadn't turned into a monster overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process over 12 years of marriage. He had systematically chipped away at my independence, convincing me that his career, his family, and his social standing were the only priorities that mattered. Whenever I tried to set boundaries, he'd turn it around, framing my needs as selfish. While my mother's health rapidly declined over her final 6 months, Mark's insensitivity reached a fever pitch. I spent exhausting nights in hospice rooms, holding my mom's frail hand, while Mark bombarded my phone with angry messages. He wasn't concerned about my grief or my mother's pain. He was furious that I wasn't at home preparing formal dinners for his parents or organizing his brother's networking events. To Mark, my family was an inconvenience that took away from the image of the perfect, attentive wife he demanded. The ultimate breaking point came 3 days before the service. When I told him my mother had passed, Mark barely looked up from his laptop. Instead of holding me, he simply asked if the funeral would interfere with his family's annual summer barbecue. When I told him the memorial fell on the same afternoon, he flatly refused to attend mine. He claimed his family's tradition couldn't be rescheduled for depressing affairs. He truly believed I would keep quiet, accept his disrespect, and bow to his demands as I always had. He assumed my father was just a gentle, retired old man who would passively let him run the show. Mark had no idea that behind my father's quiet demeanor was a sharp, calculating mind, and that his 12 years of controlling behavior were about to cost him everything. The moment the memorial service ended, my father didn't say a word. He simply gestured toward his car. Instead of staying behind to receive condolences, we drove straight across town toward Mark's family estate. The rage inside me had turned into a cold, terrifying focus. When we pulled into the gated driveway, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Upbeat music blared over poolside speakers, and Mark's relatives were casually enjoying steaks and champagne. Mark was standing near the patio, holding a drink and laughing with his brother. When he saw my father and me walk through the side gate, his smile flickered for a fraction of a second before morphing back into his usual smug expression. He walked over, completely unfazed, assuming he had successfully bullied me into submission. He even had the audacity to chuckle softly, whispering, "Glad you finally came to your senses, Jasmine. Next time, don't leave your phone on speaker like a child." His family watched from the patio, smirked, and returned to their conversations, treating my mother's passing as nothing more than a minor awkward interruption. My father stepped forward. He didn't yell, nor did he make a dramatic scene. He looked Mark dead in the eye, reached into his suit jacket, and pulled out a heavy, notarized manila envelope. "You asked my daughter to put you first, Mark," my father said, his voice ringing loud enough to cut through the music and draw every guest's attention. "So, we came to deliver your top priority in person." Mark's smirk finally vanished. He looked at the envelope, then at my father's icy expression, suddenly realizing that this wasn't a tearful apology, it was an execution. Mark snatched the envelope, ripping it open with visibly trembling fingers. As his eyes scanned the formal legal documents, the color drained from his face until he was completely ghost white. What Mark had conveniently buried under years of arrogant bravado was the single truth behind his success. My father was the silent founder and primary guarantor of Mark's logistics firm. 8 years ago, when Mark was struggling with failed startups, my father quietly invested $700,000, signed the commercial lease guarantees, and secured his primary credit lines. Mark had convinced himself that his own brilliant mind built the company, treating my father's financial backing as a permanent birthright. The documents in Mark's hands were an immediate revocation of all personal guarantees, an eviction notice for his corporate office building, which my father owned outright, and an emergency freeze on his operating capital accounts. "What is this?" Mark stammered, his voice cracking as his mother and brother hurried over from the poolside. "You can't do this, Richard. This will destroy my business. By Monday morning. You demanded that my daughter put you first," my father replied smoothly, stepping directly between Mark and me when Mark tried to grab my wrist. "So, I am settling your affairs before anything else. As of 5 minutes ago, your credit lines are closed, your office lease is terminated, and every dollar of my capital has been withdrawn." Mark turned to me, his eyes wide with desperate panic, trying to invoke the power he used to hold over me. "Jasmine, tell him to stop. You're my wife. You can't let him do this to us." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt absolutely nothing. There is no us anymore, Mark. By Monday morning, Mark's comfortable world was entirely in ruins. His corporate bank accounts were frozen, his vendors were refusing shipments, and his office building manager informed him that locks were being changed at noon. Over the next 48 hours, my phone blew up with over 60 missed calls and endless frantic text messages from Mark, shifting wildly between desperate pleas for forgiveness and explosive, venomous threats. The mask had completely fallen off his family, too. Mark's mother, who had treated me like an insignificant outsider for 12 years, suddenly started ringing my doorbell, crying on my porch about family unity and how Mark was just stressed and overwhelmed. His brother sent long emails begging my father to reconsider, admitting that Mark's business was the financial anchor keeping their own lavish lifestyle afloat. Without my father's backing, the entire family's house of cards was collapsing. Seeing their desperation only solidified my resolve. I felt no guilt, no regret, and no desire to fix what Mark had broken. For 12 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into his world. Now, standing on my own 2 feet, I finally saw him for what he was, a small, insecure man who mistook my father's generosity for his own genius. On Wednesday afternoon, while Mark was frantically pacing inside his empty, locked-up office building, my process server walked in and handed him a thick stack of papers. It wasn't a business settlement or a second chance. It was a formal petition for divorce, demanding an immediate freeze on all joint marital assets and total severance of our legal ties. Mark watched through the glass door as the server walked away, finally realizing that the quiet, obedient wife he thought he owned was gone forever. 3 weeks later, we gathered in a high-rise conference room downtown for the emergency settlement hearing. Mark sat across the long table, flanked by a court-appointed lawyer he could barely afford. The contrast was brutal. The sharp, polished man who used to strut around in designer suits now looked hollow, disheveled, and completely drained. His arrogance was replaced by a quiet, desperate panic. His attorney tried to negotiate, proposing a gradual restructuring of the business debt and begging for a portion of my family's assets to keep Mark's company afloat. But my father's legal team laid out our prenuptial agreement alongside the evidence of Mark's financial mismanagement. The contracts were ironclad. Because the business was built entirely on my father's personal guarantees and revocable capital, Mark had zero legal leverage. The judge reviewed the filings with a stern face and ruled entirely in our favor. Mark was ordered to liquidate his remaining corporate inventory, surrender his luxury lease vehicles, and vacate the office premises immediately to satisfy outstanding creditor claims. He was left with nothing but his personal debts and a reputation in tatters. His status-obsessed family quickly scattered, unable to offer him any financial rescue. As I signed the final dissolution papers, I watched Mark slump back in his chair, staring blankly at the polished wooden table. For 12 long years, he had treated me like an option, convinced that I would forever remain silent and obedient in the shadows. I picked up my pen, stood tall beside my father, and walked out of that courtroom without offering Mark a single backward glance. The nightmare was officially over, and my real life was finally about to begin. It took hitting rock bottom on the worst day of my life to finally realize my own worth. At 42 years old, I had spent over a decade letting someone else dictate my value, dimming my light to keep a toxic marriage alive. But standing beside my father, honoring my mother's memory, I learned that real strength isn't about enduring disrespect. It's about walking away from it forever. I used my share of the recovered assets to move into a quiet coastal town, where I opened a small community garden in honor of my mother. My father retired completely, spending his days sitting on the porch, enjoying the peace he had fought so hard to protect. Mark was forced to start over from absolute zero, working an entry-level sales job just to pay off his mounting personal debts. Leaving Mark wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my peace of mind. My mother would have been proud to see me finally standing tall, holding my head high, and living a life built on self-respect. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a partner show their true colors during a family crisis? How did you handle it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and please comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached.